Hello. As you know, I didn't get all the way through my prepared slides in today's lecture for GV4e2, so here's a quick presentation of the final few slides. You will have noticed in this morning's lecture that we talked a great deal about the dangers of inflation and whether or not central bank independence is well suited to prevent it and whether or not preventing it should be weighted so highly. Thus, the discussion revolved around the problem of high inflation and the significance to attach to it. But since 2008, there has been a very different problem on the policy agenda, and that's the problem of low inflation or even deflation. And this problem can also be a very serious problem for economies. Think about it, the simplest way to think about it is just to think about the case of deflation, the case of a general fall in prices. Faced in a situation where prices in general are falling, consider what happens to an individual firm. It goes out and it signs contracts to pay workers to buy materials, has those workers do some work, they process the materials, they have something to sell, and the moment they get to sell it, the price level has fallen against that price level, or compared to that price level at which the contracts were drawn up and the materials were bought. So in that kind of environment, it's very hard to make a profit. You can say something pretty similar about very low inflation, because it may be hard to change relative prices, and particularly the price of labor, in a very low inflation environment. So, low inflation can be a big problem. Also, as we were seeing previously in the discussion of balance sheet recessions, low inflation could be a problem if debt is very broadly distributed through an economy and widely weighing down economic activity. A lack of inflation that would allow clearing out of that debt could be a big problem, or make that problem of a debt overhang persist. So it is certainly the case that low inflation or deflation could be a big economic problem, but the significance of this problem for the whole issue of central bank independence has been relatively little explored. I've selected for this week one reading, one specified at the beginning in the reference at the bottom of this page by Colleen Posar on central bank independence in circumstances of a liquidity trap. And a liquidity trap is the particular kind of economic problem that many economists feel like we're facing today. So what is a liquidity trap, and why might you want to have inflation to overcome it? A liquidity trap exists when the propensity to borrow and spend, businesses and consumers' willingness to borrow money to invest or spend, is very low. In such circumstances, we say that actors, businesses, and consumers want to be liquid. They want their assets in liquid form that can be easily spent, as opposed to less liquid form, like a long-term investment can't be easily spent. And a liquidity trap exists when there is a low propensity to borrow and spend, even when interest rates are very low, even when they're close to zero. In these circumstances, you can get self-fulfilling prophecies of a recession or of slow growth. So, actors with a low propensity to invest and borrow and spend look around and say, everybody's in this same situation. There's not going to be any economic growth because nobody wants to borrow and spend, and so we better not borrow and spend either. So a circumstance of expectations characteristic of a liquidity trap can feed on itself and persist. How might one fight such a liquidity trap? Well, the traditional measures of central banks don't work very well. They can cut interest rates, but if they've cut interest rates to zero and still people aren't borrowing and spending, then that instrument isn't effective anymore. You may hear now and then about interest rates even going a bit below zero. Even that does not seem to be doing the trick. So, what else might a central bank do? A central bank, so I'm now talking about monetary measures. A central bank might decide that it could create expectations of inflation. It tries to say, we will attain a given inflation rate no matter what it takes, no matter how much money we have to print. Actors' expectations that that inflation rate would indeed be achieved means that the interest rate on any money that they borrow will, in real terms, will actually be lower. So suppose you can borrow money at 0%. You have to give back 2 years from now, say exactly the amount you borrowed. That was what 0% borrowing means. How could the interest rate go even lower than that? Well, suppose that you knew that over those 2 years there would be a certain amount of inflation. So it's not even the case that you borrow money now and you have to give the same amount back in 2 years, but the amount that you give back 2 years from now will be worth less than the amount you're borrowing now. So in effect, you're being paid to take money. So if you believe there's going to be inflation and that the inflation is going to be higher than the interest rate, you ought to go out and borrow money. So even though the central bank has a hard time lowering what's called the nominal interest rate below zero, the amount that it says in the contract that you have to, the percentage points on the loan that you have to pay back, can lower the real interest rate below zero if it can create expectations of inflation, making people believe that it will be easier to pay back their loans and therefore more eager to borrow money. So it needs to make a promise to create and sustain inflation. Another way of finding a liquidity trap is not through central bank policy at all, but through fiscal policy, through government borrowing and spending. In an economic situation where the economy is not doing very well because most people and businesses are not eager to borrow and spend, the government, the state, can borrow and spend money and try to stimulate the economy in that way. So those would be two possible measures to fight a liquidity trap. So what does all of this about the liquidity trap have to do with the issue of central bank independence? Well, there could be these two measures that we've just described, two kinds of measures that we've just described, monetary and fiscal measures, intersect in particular ways with central bank independence. For instance, suppose that it's necessary, or the central bank feels that it's necessary to create inflationary expectations in order to lower the real interest rate. That might require a change in its mandate. It might require the central bank to say, we previously have viewed our main mandate has previously been to keep prices stable, but now we have a mandate to increase prices, to keep prices increasing. And that could require then a redefinition of the mission of the central bank. Take the case of the European Central Bank right now. Its inflation target, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, is to maintain an inflation rate that is close to but under 2% a year. And right now, inflation in the Eurozone is less than 1% a year, and there have been recent episodes of actual deflation, and there's episodes of actual deflation in many Eurozone countries. So you could say, well, maybe that promise to get to 2% a year, if they can make it credible, will be enough to deal with the liquidity trap, but you might also argue that it is not enough to deal with the liquidity trap and that you need a new mandate, one that doesn't just focus on price stability. The second thing that one would want to say about central bank independence and using monetary policy to fight a liquidity trap is that it too like fighting inflation, like trying to lower inflation, is based on a promise. It's a promise to raise inflation. And again, you might get issues of credibility. For instance, suppose a central bank thinks, if we can convince everyone that inflation will be 4%, they'll go out and borrow lots of money because interest rates are very low, and that will stimulate the economy. And then when inflation gets up close to there, or even, say, 3%, at that point we can tighten up because we really don't think 4% inflation is so great in general. We wouldn't like to have it in general. In other words, the very hawkishness that central bankers are noted for, their desire to keep inflation very low, that's what being an inflation hawk means, the very hawkishness that enables central bankers to make credible promises to fight inflation may disable them from making credible promises to promote inflation. So one needs to think then about the character of the staffing of a central bank, and in any event, find ways of making central banks independent of inflation hawks. Turning now to fiscal policy and how fiscal policy measures to fight a liquidity trap might intersect with central bank independence. At a minimum, an active fiscal policy against the liquidity trap is going to require that the central bank doesn't hinder state borrowing and spending, which, for instance, it might do by saying, we're worried about levels of government debt, let's discourage government borrowing by putting up interest rates, for instance. That would be a policy that might not be consistent with a central bank's mandate, but an independent central bank might be able to do that. It might be able to get in the way of borrowing and spending. But the maximum thing that would be required of a central bank to help a fiscal policy response to a liquidity trap would be to actively facilitate state borrowing and spending. Now, some people feel, as we were talking about earlier in the lecture, that any time a central bank provides money for spending to a government, the effect will be to get the government reliant on that form of finance, and eventually you'll have inflation. So if you're going to have a fiscal response to a liquidity trap that relies on accommodation from the side of the central bank, concerns like that need to be diffused or politically defeated. So what all of this reveals is that the politics of central bank independence shifts quite a bit when you're moving from the main economic issue being keeping inflation from getting too high to the main economic issue being keeping inflation from getting too low. And the readings you'll do this week, and especially this Collian-Pozar one, will let you think about that. Let me talk about a couple of other political factors that shift when central bank independence intersects with circumstances of a liquidity trap, the kind of economic crisis we've had over the past 8 years or so. In these circumstances, the way in which central bank policy has distributive effect tends to change. Now, as we argued earlier, central bank policy probably always definitely does always have a distributional impact. But often that impact is very general. So we're deciding on the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Yes, we will make more people unemployed, but we certainly don't know the names of those people, and the individual circumstances will be very different, not a recognizable, clearly defined group. Yes, we're making life better or worse for creditors or debtors, but we're making life better or worse for creditors or debtors as a whole, as an entire group. So the policies are distributional, but they're very general in form. In a financial crisis, central banks, in the recent financial crisis anyway, central banks have found themselves engaged in policies that have distributional effects that are much more concrete and specifiable, that we know the names, as it were, of the organizations that are being helped by this policy. So instead of a general open market operation designed to alter interest rates, you have central banks engaging in what I explained earlier was called quantitative easing. They buy various assets, not just government bonds, but all sorts of assets, including bonds issued by businesses. And the purpose of this policy is to put money in the hands of businesses or individuals that had previously lent money. Maybe they'd lent that money to governments, maybe they'd lent that money to individual businesses. This lending had created bonds. The bonds were purchased by the central bank, and the money is now back in the hands of the lenders, and maybe they'll do more lending. So that is a form of policy that has much more concrete distributional effects. Another distributional effect of that policy is to lower interest rates on all the assets, on all the categories of lending reflected in the assets that the central bank is buying. So if the central bank is buying government bonds in these circumstances anyway of very low inflation, it will tend to drive the interest rates on those bonds down, meaning that governments will be able to borrow more cheaply. In the Eurozone context, this means, for instance, that you have a policy that the central bank is conducting that allows some countries to borrow more cheaply than they otherwise would be able to do so, and that raises, for some people, concerns about intra-European distributional shifts, right? So again, we know the name. It's Italy that's benefiting, for instance. And that creates distributional issues and distributional conflicts that are not present when you have a much more generalized policy. So you might think that the shift in form of distributional effect from the general to the concrete might also require a corresponding increase in democratic legitimacy. At any rate, the policy looks or feels less technocratic because it's not addressed to abstract categories of beneficiaries. It's addressed to much more concrete ones. It may also be the case that there is a shift in the need for speed and secrecy. It might be the case that central banks in crisis circumstances actually have to operate much more quickly and with much greater secrecy so that unstable markets will be not further destabilized by rumors of their proceedings. If that's so, then you might want to have higher central bank independence in a crisis, or might observe that as a de facto result of the people running central banks acting on the perceived need for speed and secrecy. And so that need for increased central bank independence might cross-cut pressures for better oversight in a crisis. And finally, it's arguable, and most people who believe in liquidity traps, as previously explained, would make this argument that one needs better coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy in a liquidity trap than one might need in more ordinary circumstances. And again, central bank independence might interfere with that coordination. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the lecture. My apologies that I couldn't get through it all in our ordinary time, and thanks for listening to me here. Just to sum up, we've talked about the issue of whether central banks ought to be independent from day-to-day political control. And I just want to conclude by saying that that is in effect a constitutional question. It's a question, if we think about Schumpeter's definition of democracy, which is that political leaders acquire the power to decide on the basis of a competitive struggle for the people's vote, right? There is the issue of what do they get to decide, and constitutionalism limits what they get to decide. They get to decide how the powers of the presidency will be used, for instance, but not whether or not there is a presidency altogether. The structuring of a central bank is similarly a constitutional question, something that is not subject to easy or rapid shifts by the Democratic majority, very likely for the reasons I set out anyway at the beginning of the lecture. But obviously, it is a constitutional question with critical implications for the extent of democracy's ability to control and manage capitalism. So when you look at the seminar agenda for this week, you'll get a chance to see some of the questions about how democracy and capitalism intersect in this specific institution of the central bank.